My name is Larry Atchison, and thank you all for your interest in this topic. And we have covered a lot of ground in what I hope is not only my quest for truth, but I hope it's our mutual quest for truth. Once I finish this presentation, we will have connected all the dots. We will see the path the word God has taken as it made its way to the English language. When we're finished, I would like to do a comparison between the origin supplied by most scholars and the origin that I have found in my own independent research. Many of us have either heard of a 1960s TV show called The Twilight Zone, hosted by Rod Serling, or else maybe we've watched some of the episodes. The stories generally consisted of nightmares that really came true, or at least they really came true for the actors each week. I watched The Twilight Zone as a child, and the show actually gave me nightmares. Rod Serling would always give viewers an opening narrative to introduce them to each episode, and one line I especially remember from one episode is him telling the audience that what the character was about to experience was too incredible to be real, too real to be a dream. That line comes close to describing the journey that we're taking with this presentation. The only difference is the incredible journey that we're on is 100% real. Everything I presented in this presentation is real, and it's based on truth. But it's so contrary to how we've all been raised and taught to believe that it seems too incredible to be true. As I mentioned in a previous presentation, the message I'm bringing is not one that I can share with the average believer. As you most likely know, believers in the Creator, as revealed in the Bible, are becoming fewer and fewer. But those few who are left are oftentimes not able to receive or accept the message I'm bringing in this presentation. Of course, non-believers are even more unlikely to accept this message, but it's too incredible to be real and too real to be a dream. In fact, it is real and it is the truth. With my previous presentations, I've gone into lengthy reviews of previous presentations. And I was prepared to have a review of the fact that the translators of the Bible not only covered up the fact that God is the name of a false idol, but they also covered up the fact that Dios, which is the name or title the Spanish culture collectively uses for the Creator, yes, even Dios was originally the name of a pagan idol. However, I plan on covering so much ground with this presentation that I have no choice but to skip past my review slides. So I'm going to skip through these. If Tony's recording this, then you can play back the recording. You can at least pause the recording to view these slides as you watch them. And this is just a screenshot from a Spanish Bible showing the translators of the Spanish Bibles replaced Dios with Jupiter in Acts chapter 14, verses 12 through 13. Dios is the name in the original text. And this image is taken from a Sacred Name Spanish Bible that we were given back in 1991, in which they correct the translator's error by restoring the pagan deity's name in Acts 14, verse 13. The Spanish Bible is called Las Escrituras Mesiánicas, which means the Messianic writings. It was published in 1990 by the Asociación de Investigación Bíblica and printed in the Dominican Republic. And here's an enlargement of the text in Acts 14, verse 13, as it appears in Las Escrituras Mesiánicas. And this slide shows that in 2 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 2, Antiochus Epiphanes renamed the temple Dios Olympiou. So Antiochus Epiphanes worshipped a pagan idol named Dios. This slide shows where the translators covered up a pagan deity whose name is pronounced God. It's spelled Gimel Daleth in Hebrew, and it's pronounced God. So just to be clear, According to the original Hebrew text of Isaiah 65, verse 11, those who worship God have forsaken Yahweh. At least that's what Yahweh has to say about the name God. But to many people, the concern isn't about what Yahweh thinks about God, but rather it's what they think about God. Many people have told me, well, that's not what God means to me. They don't realize that this isn't about them. I'm not interested in what God means to them. I am interested in what God means to Yahweh. And all it takes is one verse for us to know what God means to Yahweh. It's a name identifying a pagan idol. That's what God means to Yahweh. And if Yahweh doesn't want us incorporating God in our worship, then I don't either. So as we move on with part 5, I want to finish what I started in part 3. In part 3, I established the fact that a pagan deity named God was worshipped in the ancient cities of Haran, Dura Europos, and Palmyra. If that's the only place on the planet offering evidence that an idol named God was worshipped there, I probably wouldn't have much of a case validating how God came to end up in our Bibles and how nearly everyone out there thinks God is the Creator's name. But our journey has just begun as we make our way to our final destination, and then the connection will be clear. And to establish my case, I will list all the connections. I will connect the dots. So let's get started. So here's a map I displayed in part 3. This map shows the 3 cities where an idol named God was definitely worshipped. Those are Haran, Dura Europos, and Palmyra. We covered the fact that according to the book of Enoch, the being who deceived Eve was none other than that old serpent, the devil, but his name wasn't Satan or even Lucifer. No, it was Gadrael. This slide shows an excerpt from the book of Enoch, chapter 68 and verse 6. His name was Gadrael. So there's dot number 1. Gadrael is who deceived Eve, according to the book of Enoch. We need to consider the fact that the short form of Gadrael is God. Let's face it, the short form of Yahweh is Yah. The short form of Gadrael is God. Then there's Godan. Godan is the deity whose name was shortened to God, the same God that we see in most English Bibles today. This is information found in a book written by highly respected 18th century etymologist Daniel Fenning. And here's a scanned copy from page 140 of Daniel Fenning's book. You might think Daniel Fenning as maybe the Noah Webster of the 18th century England, as he also compiled the Royal English Dictionary in 1761, and it was the standard dictionary in England for many years. Daniel Fenning traces the God of our English and German Bibles to a contraction of the name Godan, and the contraction became God. This information is such an important piece to the puzzle that I'm including it as one of the dots that we need to connect. And please remember that to Daniel Fenning, this was mere trivia, a curious tidbit about how the English translation God came into our Bibles. He himself had no problem with referring to the Almighty as God. So Daniel Fenning, by all accounts, was unbiased in what he wrote. Our next dot, connecting dot, is the fact that an idol named God was worshipped in an area known as Haran. I know the King James Version spells this name Haran, but since modern maps spell it with 2 R's, that's what I'm doing here. I covered the fact that God was worshipped in Haran in parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if that's not enough, I go into even more detail validating this fact in our online study, which is called God's Identity, according to ancient Hebrew scholars, which is on our website. The fact that an idol named God was worshipped in Haran is important, and we're about to see why this fact is so important. And here's another look at the map displaying not only Haran, but the known region where archaeologists have found inscriptions dedicated to God. I need to emphasize that this triangular area only represents the known region where the deity named God was worshipped. Is it possible that the worship of God extended beyond this region? Well, of course, the answer is yes, but for now, my point is God was indeed worshipped in Haran. And let's not forget the fact that scholarly references spell this deity's name out as G-A-D in English. This is an obvious attempt to distinguish the pagan idol from the English Bible's G-O-D. Most casual English speakers think G-A-D is the name of a pagan idol, and G-O-D is the name of the true creator. Very few people out there know that both words are spelled the same in Hebrew, and even fewer know that they're also pronounced the same in Hebrew. And that pronunciation is God. I covered all this in part 1, so if you missed it, I should let you know that part 1 is now available for viewing on our website. Most important of all is the fact that nowhere in all of Scripture is the true creator ever referred to as God in the original languages. God is simply the word translators chose to use when translating the Hebrew title Elohim into English. And I dare say the adversary is who inspired them to do it, not Yahweh. So why is it so important that I mentioned the fact that God was worshipped in Haran? It's because that's where sisters Leah and Rachel were born and raised. They were right there in the midst of a region where idolatry was in vogue. But this raises another question. So think about this. We all know who Rebekah was. Rebekah was the wife of the righteous Isaac, and Rebekah's brother was a man named Laban, and Laban lived in Haran. Laban was the father of Leah and Rachel, so Laban was Jacob's uncle on his mother's side. We know that Jacob stole his brother's birthright and ended up moving north to his uncle's hometown of Haran. And of course, he fell in love with Rachel, and we know the rest of the story. But since Rachel's dad, Laban, was Rebekah's brother, this surely means he was a righteous man, right? Even though he lived in the midst of an idolatrous region, he himself worshiped Yahweh only, correct? Well, if you believe Laban was a righteous man who only worshiped Yahweh, you may want to reread the book of Genesis. Laban was an idol worshiper like everyone else in his region, or at least the Bible doesn't mention anyone in that area who rejected idol worship. And this brings me to my next very important point, my next dot. The fact is, both Leah and Rachel worshiped idols. You don't have to believe me, but hopefully you can believe what the Bible says. In Genesis 35, verse 2, Jacob was compelled to command his household and all that were with him to put away all the strange Elohim that were among them. Telling them to put away the strange Elohim that were among them was a polite way of saying that he told them to get rid of the idols they were worshiping. I have a difficult time believing they had strange Elohim if they didn't worship those strange Elohim. So let's connect the dots with the fact that Leah was raised by an idol worshiper, and until the day when her husband finally commanded her and the rest of his household to put away the idols they were worshiping, that's exactly what she did. And she was still an idol worshiper when she left Haran with her husband Jacob and family. My next important point is the fact that Leah named Zilpah's son God. We hopefully know the story behind Leah giving Zilpah's son the name God. Leah wasn't giving her husband Jacob any children, so somehow she considered the act of giving her handmaid Zilpah to Jacob to have children in her place as being the same thing as her being the actual mother. So when Zilpah gave birth to a son, Leah essentially said, "with God's help," which is an acceptable translation of the Hebrew phrase, "ba God," as I covered in part 3. Miles Coverdale, in the translation that he produced in 1535, had Leah say, "this is good luck." And of course, God is the idol of good fortune, or as some would say, good luck. We know Leah was raised in a pagan environment. So did she name Zilpah's son after the deity of fortune named God? Or, as some would have you believe, was she inspired by the Holy Spirit to come up with that name? To me, the answer is obvious. I've extensively covered the fact that Jacob tolerated idol worship in his household the entire time they lived in Haran, which is a period of 20 years. It wasn't until they left Haran and were on their journey to Canaan that Jacob commanded his household to get rid of the idols that they were worshiping, that were in their possession. This is an important point because the opposition claims that if there had been anything at all pagan about the name God, Jacob would not have permitted Leah to name Zilpah's son God. The fact is, Jacob tolerated idol worship the entire time he stayed in Haran. So would Jacob have stopped Leah from giving his son the name God? No, he would not have stopped her. I can imagine that Grandpa Laban was elated that Leah named Zilpah's son God. I've already covered the fact that in Exodus 23:13, we are commanded not to mention the names of other Elohim. Now, of course, the command to not speak the names of heathen idols wasn't actually given until after the Exodus from Egypt, or at least that's where the first record of such a commandment is found. We've already covered these verses, Exodus 23, verse 13, where we are commanded to not mention the names of other Elohim, and that command is repeated in Joshua chapter 23, verses 6 and 7. And here's a refresher slide just to reinforce the fact that we really aren't supposed to be mentioning the names of heathen idols, at least not in a reverent or positive light. Elijah mentioned the name of the heathen idol Baal, but it was in a disparaging way. One of the great mysteries of the Bible is how Jacob, the son of the righteous Isaac, tolerated idol worship the entire 20 years of his residence in Haran. But it's a scriptural fact. And if you don't believe me, just reread Genesis chapter 35, and you can stop reading with verse 2. Another important point that needs to be factored into the discussion is how ancient believers understood the intent of the command to not mention the names of other Elohim. It would obviously be difficult to tell someone that a certain deity is a false deity without identifying it by name. So in this presentation, I have addressed the fact that ancient believers understood this command to be a directive against mentioning the names of other Elohim in a worshipful or otherwise positive way. An example I used in part 2 is that of Elijah. Did Elijah violate the command to not mention the names of other Elohim when he told the people, if Yahweh be Elohim, then follow him, but if Baal, then follow him? I don't think so. That's found in 1 Kings 18, verse 21. If you read the Hebrew text of 1 Kings 18, verse 19, he also mentioned the name of a female deity named Asherah. He mentioned their names as a means of identifying the names of who those pagans worshipped, but it was most certainly not in a worshipful or otherwise respectful way. And that's why in this presentation, I do mention the name God, but not in a worshipful or respectful way. I'm identifying the name of a pagan deity whose name has been very cleverly applied as either the name or title of the true Creator. Okay, another important point that I feel is often either disregarded or ignored by a large contingency of the sacred name movement is the fact that believers who had been named after heathen idols were not expected to change their names when they were converted. I've been acquainted with several members of the sacred name movement who, upon discovering that their name was associated with the name of a pagan deity, they changed their name. I'm not trying to say anything negative about these people, and that is certainly their choice. But then again, this begs the question of why some pretty heavyweight believers mentioned in the New Testament, such as Apollos and Hermes, were never expected to change their names. Hermes, I'm so sorry your mother named you after a pagan idol. Aren't you going to change your name? No, Hermes was not expected to change his name. While there are a few recorded instances of believers having their names changed, it's more the exception than the norm, and it never had anything to do with their original names having been emanated from the name of a pagan idol. Maybe this goes to show that if believers didn't change their names, even when they came to realize they were named after a pagan idol, then maybe we should think of the bigger picture and of how important it is that we don't tamper with the Creator's name. Okay, for the next dot I want to connect, I want to make certain you understand that the wording really is blurred here in this yellow box. It's blurred, sketchy, smeared, however you want to describe it, but it's mostly illegible. That's because it's a point that I really haven't focused on yet in this presentation, but I'm about to. And once we cover my now blurry point, it won't be blurry at all. It will be clear. And once I make my currently blurry point clear, we should then hopefully be willing to accept my final point that God is now the generally accepted translation of the Hebrew title Elohim. But not only that, but this same God is the same God whose worship Yahweh condemns. In fact, many of you, like me, were not only taught that God is an acceptable title for the true Creator, but that it's the English name of the Creator. And this is one of the most elaborate deceptions of all time, so cleverly done that even with a 5-part presentation like this, most people will not see or believe it's true. And I'm not even talking about those who aren't the least bit interested in investigating this subject. So is the name of the Creator really God? And if not, is God even an acceptable title for the Creator of the universe? That is the ultimate question. So let's get back to that blurred out point because it's time to uncover it. So here's the missing point. This point, like all the ones that came before it, is critical. The worship of God spreads to other lands. The opposition, that is, those who claim that God, the God of our Bibles, isn't connected to the God whose worship is condemned by Yahweh, they want you to believe the worship of God was a localized form of idolatry that never expanded beyond the Middle East. Even on the surface, this argument defies logic and sound reasoning, at least to me. Nevertheless, if you follow the breadcrumbs, so to speak, you can see that yes, the worship of the deity named God slithered around the globe, all the way across Eurasia, Europe, and yes, all the way to the United States and beyond. So let's follow those breadcrumbs and see where they lead. The breadcrumb trail starts in the Garden of Eden. We know from the Bible that it was the serpent who deceived Eve, successfully tempting her to eat from the tree of the knowledge of righteousness and evil. We know from the book of Enoch that the name of this serpent is Gadrael. And we know that if we shorten the serpent's name, it is God. And hopefully we know by now that GAD is correctly pronounced God in both Hebrew and Greek. It's only in English that we're taught that the false deity's name is pronounced Gad, as in sad, whereas the creator's name is God, as in sod. That's what we've been taught to believe. So just to be clear, it can truly be stated that the serpent's name is God. And here's a refresher of a slide I've already displayed several times, but as we follow the breadcrumb trail, we know that by the time of Jacob, the false deity named God was worshipped not only in Haran, but Palmyra and Dura Europos as well. A point I previously made is basically this. If we know God was worshipped in that area, does that mean that's where God worship was confined? I've been told that I'm a naive person, but come on, we should all know that just because no one has reported archaeological finds of carvings dedicated to an idol named God doesn't mean those people didn't worship God. And that brings me to another breadcrumb. So we're following breadcrumbs, and it's taking us to Russia? How can that be? What evidence is there that God was worshipped in Russia? Is it possible that the worship of an idol named God made its way to Russia? I'm not able to directly prove that an idol named God was worshipped in Russia, but there are some strong clues that he was and maybe still is. To help us with our investigation, there's a dictionary called the Transliterated Dictionary of the Russian Language, edited by Eugene Garfield and published by ISI Press in 1979. In this dictionary, we find a very intriguing characteristic regarding words that begin with the prefix GAD. In fact, the very word spelled GAD, which we know is pronounced God, has the most intriguing meaning of all. So let's take a look. So here's an excerpt from page 23 of the portion of Garfield's dictionary titled Transliterated Russian English section. This dictionary is actually available online as a PDF file, and the link is posted on this slide for anyone who wants to check it out themselves. But take a look at the words that begin with GAD. What does the word pronounced God mean in Russian? Well, it says here it means reptile. Say, isn't the serpent a reptile? Isn't God the name of the serpent who tempted Eve to eat the forbidden fruit? The answer is yes. God, or Gadrael, is the name of the serpent who tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. So is it just a coincidence that if you say the word God in Russian, it means reptile? And more importantly, is it just a coincidence that reptiles were worshipped in Russia? Although I've known for many years that the word pronounced God in the Russian language means reptile, I wasn't aware of the fact that Russians worshipped reptiles until fairly recently. I found this information in a book titled Irish Druids and Old Irish Religions by James Bonwick. James Bonwick published his book in the year 1894. On page 183 of his book, the author mentions that Muscovites and Lithuanians had serpent idols. Of course, Muscovites are inhabitants of Moscow, and Lithuania borders the eastern side of the Baltic Sea. He adds that in pagan Russia, the serpent was the protector of brides. Now, please take notice of the last two sentences on this slide. It says one of the symbols of both Hercules and the Celtic Hu was a serpent. Please remember the Celtic deity Hu, because we will see later that etymologists include the deity named Hu in their own tracing of the origin of the word God. Please also notice that the German white serpent gave wisdom to the eater of it, or so they believed. I hope we're not so naive as to not believe the Germans, like everyone else, practiced serpent worship. I found additional information in a book titled Notes Upon Russia, Volume 2 by Sigismund von Herberstein, which was published in the year 1852. On page 99 of his book, von Herberstein describes religious beliefs of the people living in a province named Samogithia, and those people worshipped reptiles. On page 97, von Herberstein tells us that Samogithia is a province that lies to the north of the Baltic Sea and is next to Lithuania. I won't take the time to read the excerpt from this page because I have lots more to cover, but maybe you can read it at a later time when you play back the recording of this presentation. So anyway, reptile worship was found in a province known as Samogithia in Lithuania. How did that happen? So we found that the word pronounced God in Russian means reptile, and we found reptile worship in Russia and westward into Lithuania. And here's a map showing the location of Samogithia within the country of Lithuania. Lithuania borders present-day Belarus, and Belarus borders Russia. But who's to say what those borders were as settlers made their way westward across present-day Russia and Europe? The point is, they worshipped serpents and reptiles. And by the way, as a reminder, the Russian word for reptile is God. So I've shown from James Boswick's book that serpents were worshipped in Lithuania, and this map gives a broader overview of where things are. Samogithia is marked in red, and it is located within Lithuania. Let's take another look at the transliterated dictionary of the Russian language. We've already seen that the word pronounced God means reptile in Russian, but please notice that every single word that begins with G-A-D has a negative connotation. The very next word is gadalka, which means fortune teller. Is it just a coincidence that God is the Canaanite deity of fortune? That is what the opposition wants us to think is just a coincidence. I am persuaded that it's more than just a coincidence. It's a connection. Then we come to the word gadit, which means foul. Gadki means nasty, and gadiuka means adder. As we hopefully know, an adder is a species of serpent. Now, if we move southwest along the Baltic Sea, we come to Poland. The Russian language and the Polish language are considered to be very similar. And sure enough, not only is the Russian word for reptile pronounced God, but so is the Polish word. And yet, we know reptile worship was practiced in this vicinity. Of course, if we know reptile worship was practiced in these locations, it should be a given that it was practiced elsewhere as well. Now, just in case anyone thinks I'm manipulating the facts, here's a posting I found online several years ago. The caption for the photo says, "Saber-tooth cattle skeleton keeps its secrets at Delamar Dry Lake Bed, Nevada." In response, someone with a screen named I Am Adam, he wrote, "Oh my God." Then someone with a screen named Yuri Brisk wrote, "Oh my God." And he wrote, "Oh my God." And then he used Russian characters there, you see, to spell out the word God. He added, quote, "God is a Russian word for reptile, and it spells the same way as God." So Yuri Brisk saw the irony of saying, saying, "Oh my God," in English while looking at the photo of the skeletal remains of an animal that resembles a reptilian creature. And the word reptile, as he confirmed, is translated God in the Russian language. So yes, if you say God in Russian, you are conveying a word that means reptile. I might add that if you want to jokingly tell someone, "Oh, you are so nasty," you would say, "You are so God." Now let's see if we can follow the breadcrumbs. So let's say that God worship originated in the area of Haran, where Leah and Rachel were raised and where most of Jacob's children were born. And let's say that the adversary, known as that old serpent, the devil, wants to be worshiped. And let's say that a short form of his name is God, which means the serpent is God. I believe I have shown all of this to be true, and hopefully we all know he does want to be worshiped. I haven't really covered this aspect of the devil too heavily, but it too is actually a very important component in this discussion. I probably should have put that as my very first dot in connecting the dots. In the famous temptation of Yeshua, the adversary, who we all know as Satan, tempted Yeshua and offered to give him all the kingdoms of the world if he would fall down and worship him. It's true that Yeshua addressed him as Satan, but in actual fact, the word Satan isn't really his name. And according to the text of the Hebrew Matthew, Yeshua addressed him as Ha-Satan, which means the adversary. Now, you don't put the in front of a person's name when you address him or her. When I speak with Tony, I don't address him as the Tony. So to be clear, Satan is a noun that means adversary. So if we truly want to put a name on the adversary, his name is God. So here in the book of Matthew chapter 4, the Satan, who the book of Enoch reveals as having the name God-Rael, wanted Yeshua to worship him, and Yeshua would not do so. I would read this excerpt from Matthew chapter 4, but again, I know I'm running short on time with lots more to cover. So yes, I probably should have put the fact that the devil wants to be worshiped as the very first dot to connect to the others. Of course, there are other Bible passages that speak of the adversary's desire to be worshiped and to even take Yahweh's place, if such a thing were possible. Isaiah 14 is understood as a parable against the king of Babylon, but many Bible scholars see a parallel indictment against the adversary, who is behind all evil governments. And here's the text of Isaiah 14, verses 12 through 20, which I will skip over for now due to time constraints. I think it's clear that the adversary is the one being addressed here, but it's made even more clear in Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 1 through 19. I would read those verses as well, but hopefully you understand my point that without me having to dwell on it any more than I already have, that Satan, the adversary, wants to be worshiped. So here's what should have been the very first dot to connect. It's the key to the deception. The whole world seems to collectively give the devil exactly what he wants. Mankind collectively worships him, and we don't even know it. And can you imagine trying to persuade any of the plethora of television evangelists that the name and or title that they're attributing to the Creator is actually the name of the adversary? It's kind of like the quote from the Twilight Zone that I mentioned earlier. It's too incredible to be real, but too real to be a dream. And yet it's very true and it's very real. So let's get back to tracing the breadcrumbs and connecting the dots. We have shown without any question that God was worshipped in Haran. But not only that, God was worshipped in Dura Europos, Palmyra, cities that were at least 200 miles from each other. Is it safe to speculate that the worship of God expanded way beyond that area? Could it have traveled north? Well, we've seen that the word pronounced God in Russian means reptile. We've seen that reptiles were worshipped in Russia and Lithuania, and moving southwest into Poland, we've seen that the word pronounced God is Polish, just like in Russian, and it means reptile. Is it even remotely possible that the reptile God is connected to the serpent named God-Rael from the Garden of Eden? Oh, and as we track westward, Which country comes next? That's right, it's Germany. Now, in Germany, the dialect changes and God is pronounced Gott. But this can't be the same God we've traced from Haran, can it? Or can it? We have already covered the fact that the Teutons, upon conversion to Christianity, applied Gott to the true Heavenly Father. You may also recall from a previous slide that pagan Germans believed eating a white snake made them wiser. They attributed power to the serpent. And here's a slide I'm borrowing from part 1 of my presentation as a refresher for those who may not remember that the German pronunciation of God is Gott, plus that when the Teutonic peoples converted to Christianity, its pre-Christian meanings were applied to the Christian sense. They say God originally referred to that which is worshipped or invoked in sacrificial offerings. The article goes on to say, with the conversion of the Teutonic peoples to Christianity, its pre-Christian meanings were largely reshaped and absorbed into the Judeo-Christian tradition. In other words, its pagan application was given a fresh, new look to make it look not so bad. So using this sort of reasoning, we can take any pagan or otherwise vile word, redefine it as something righteous, then insert it into a select verse to shine a positive light on it. When you think about it, isn't taking something evil and transforming or reshaping into something righteous, isn't that what the adversary has been doing all along? Making something that is oh so wrong seem oh so right? The Apostle Paul clearly had a problem with deceitful people. The world is full of deceitful people. And I've even encountered a few right here in what's known as the Sacred Name Movement. I could tell some stories, but let's suffice it to say, I agree with the Apostle Paul. I don't have any use for deceitful people. And here's why. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Messiah. And no marvel. In other words, we shouldn't be surprised. No marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. This is taken from 2 Corinthians 11, verses 13 through 15. So, I might say, those who transform the pagan god into what they believe is a noble name and or title for Yahweh are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming something evil into something righteous. And no marvel, as in it's nothing to be surprised about, for Satan himself is transformed from an evil, rebellious angel into an angel of light. But this isn't something I might say. I'm saying it outright. Here we go. Those who transform the pagan god into what they believe is a noble name and or title for Yahweh are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming something evil into something righteous. And no marvel, as in it's nothing to be surprised about, for Satan himself is transformed from an evil, rebellious angel into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no big surprise if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. These are my words. I'm not trying to add anything to the Bible, just in case someone thinks that's what I'm doing here. But based on my research findings, that's exactly what's being done here. It's a very subtle transformation, or shall I say, reshaping. And nearly the entire world has fallen for it, so it's something perfectly natural and appropriate for the world. So just to summarize the Teutonics' understanding of God, it was used in reference to the deities they worshipped, but reshaped or transformed into a clean, non-pagan word when they converted to Christianity. But who reshaped it? Who transformed it into a new and different meaning? Was it man or was it Yahweh? If it was man, who influenced him to do such a thing? And how did God find its way into the Teutonics' vocabulary in the first place? Was it just there? Or is it found along the trail we've been tracking across Europe? An even bigger question is, was God used by the Teutonic peoples as a title, as suggested by this reference, or was it used as a name? Please notice that if we continue reading on this slide, it says the word God was used to translate the Latin Deus, the Greek Theo, and the Hebrew Elohim. These are all titles. So it would appear, at least on the surface, that God was used by the Teutonic peoples as a title, not as a name. But is that really true? You may be surprised when you learn the truth, but first, let's identify who the Teutonic people were. So who exactly were the Teutonic peoples? Many of the references we've consulted present the Teutonic peoples as the ancient residents of what is now known as Germany. In fact, even as I began working on this presentation, I was still persuaded that the Teutonic peoples resided in what is now known as present-day Germany. While that is true, the Teutonic peoples comprised way more than just Germany. The 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica offers some insightful information about who the Teutonic peoples were and where they lived. Let's read what it says starting at the top of the page. Teutonic peoples, a comprehensive term for those populations of Europe which speak one or other of the various Teutonic languages vis-a-vis the English-speaking inhabitants of the British Isles, the German-speaking inhabitants of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Switzerland, the Flemish-speaking inhabitants of Belgium, the Scandinavian-speaking inhabitants of Sweden and Norway, and practically all the inhabitants of Holland and Denmark. Okay, I'm skipping down to this lower highlighted section. Now it says, the statement that the Teutonic peoples are those which speak Teutonic languages requires a certain amount of qualification on one side. In the British Isles, especially Ireland, there is, in addition to the Celtic-speaking elements, a considerable population which claims Celtic nationality, though it uses no language but English. And further, all Teutonic communities contain, to a greater or less degree, certain immigrant, especially Semitic, elements which have adopted the languages of their neighbors. So, just to be clear, the areas considered to be inhabited by the Teutonic people extend well beyond the borders of present-day Germany. As various tribes and clans migrated westward, it is only natural that rivals would separate and form their own clans, claiming their own lands and designate their own boundaries. I found this map at www.worldhistory.org, and it shows the distinction between the Teutonic peoples and the Celtic peoples. The Teutonic areas are shaded brown, and the Celtic areas are dark blue. And by the way, some claim that the word Celtic comes from a Latin word that means stone chisel. I also read somewhere where they say it means the tall ones. Others say it comes from a word that means boldness or ferocity. I'm unable to find any outright point of origin for either the Teutons or the Celtics, only theories. According to a first-century historian named Tacitus, the Teutons claimed to have originated from a man named Manus. Manus was himself the son of a deity named Twisto, who was the son of the earth. Now, this sounds to me like a twisted claim, so suffice it to say, no one really knows for certain how and where the Teutonic peoples and the Celtic peoples originated. The earliest recorded use of the name Celts dates to the year 517 BCE from a geographer named Hecataeus of Miletus. Suffice it to say, the Celts have been around for a very long time. I am personally persuaded that they all originated in the Middle East, and together they form a portion of the scattered tribes of Israel. This map shows areas that were known to be inhabited by the Teutons and the Celts around the year 52 BCE. Okay, I want to go back to that extensive Encyclopedia Britannica article on the Teutonic peoples because it essentially corroborates everything from the map on my previous slide. According to the information in this very credible source, the two groups were at one time the same group. In fact, it appears that before there was ever a group known as the Teutons, everyone in that area was known as the Celts. An author named Stefan Zimmer, in his article Teutonen, proposes that even the name Teutones may be interpreted as having been derived from the Proto-Celtic word tota, which means people or tribe. Stefan Zimmer's article was written in German, and I don't speak German, so thankfully a Wikipedia article provides a translation of a pertinent quote from his article. He writes, quote, "Thus, the name Teutones may be interpreted as deriving from Proto-Celtic tota, which means people or tribe." Of course, Stefan Zimmer is only proposing a theory, but the point is the Celts and the Teutons were at one time essentially the same group of people that eventually split into their own separate divisions. You may be wondering why I'm taking the time to demonstrate that the Teutonic peoples and the Celtic peoples were at one time one and the same group of people. There is a reason for this, which you will soon see. Those who support referring to the Creator as God would most likely not appreciate this information because it will further demonstrate that the God we see in our English Bibles is traced not only to serpent worship, but also to the same God who was worshipped in Haran. I'm not saying they all worship God in the same exact way because people have a way of incorporating their own unique forms of worship into the faith they practice, much like the difference that we encounter here in the USA between people who worship Yahweh. So the various clans may have had their own unique ways of worshiping God, but they nevertheless worshiped a deity named God. And this deity they worshiped was most certainly not Yahweh. So here, in this Encyclopedia Britannica article on the Teutonic peoples, we find some interesting information on the Teutonics and the Celts. Obviously, I can't read the entire article due to time constraints, so let's just focus on the portions I highlighted. We read that, quote, "With the beginning of the Iron Age, perhaps circa 500 to 400 BC, Celtic influence becomes apparent everywhere." Again, I tell you, this is important information for us to keep in mind as we trace the origin of God. So it appears Celtic influence came first, then came the Teutonics. So when did the Teutonics begin to emerge as a separate group? Well, let's read my next highlighted portion in the left column of this slide. It says, "The first recognition that the inhabitants of Germany, Holland, etc. were a distinct people, or a people distinct from their Celtic neighbors, dates from about the middle of the 1st century BC." So let's take another look at the map I showed. This map dates the separate groupings of the Celts and the Teutonic peoples to 52 BCE, and 52 BCE is right there in the middle of the 1st century BC, just as we were told in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Of course, the Celts and the Teutons didn't become separate groups overnight. It was obviously a gradual process. Okay, back to the Encyclopedia Britannica article. I think the most interesting quote on this page is found at the bottom. It says, "In none of the early records, however, do we get any clear indication that the Teutonic peoples were distinguished from the Celts." So to the best of their research, at one time the Teutons and the Celts were one and the same. Also, please notice this other quote I highlighted on this slide. It says, "At the beginning of our era, the Teutonic peoples stretched from the Rhine River to the Vistula River." Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Rhine River and the Vistula River, the Rhine River flows through Western Germany, and the Vistula River flows through Poland. Here's a broad map that shows the basic locations of the Rhine River and the Vistula River. Notice that the area I circled pretty much matches the location of the Teutons on the other map I displayed. Here's another map to give you a closer look. The Rhine River forms the West German border separating Germany from France, and then it flows up through Western Germany and empties into the North Sea. As I previously mentioned, the Vistula River flows right through the heart of Poland, going right through the capital of Poland, which is Warsaw. Now, why might it be interesting to know that the Teutonic peoples were not only found in Germany, but also in Poland? We will find out soon. Okay, I thought it'd be interesting to see what it would look like if we overlaid the boundaries of modern-day Poland onto this ancient map. Now, please remember that the Polish word for reptile is God. I've covered the fact that serpent worship was common in this area of the world, and I've covered the fact that the word pronounced God in Poland means reptile. What is also interesting about this map is the fact that it covers both Teutonic and Celtic peoples. So you got the Teutonic up north, the brown shaded area, the Celtic down south in the dark blue shaded area. As we're about to see, the answer is the Celtic and the Teutonic people, they both worshipped serpent deities. But first, let's check out serpent worship that was carried out not only in Germany, but also all over Europe. One thing to keep in mind as we follow the trail to Germany is that serpent worship was indeed practiced there. I found an interesting article in the 1910 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, this encyclopedia is one of the most widely recognized, respected, and authoritative sources for accurate information. It is even currently available on the public domain. You can access this encyclopedia article online at archive.org. Notice what it has to say about serpent worship in Europe. If I had time, I would read everything on this page, but in the interest of saving time, I will only read the highlighted portion on this slide. It says, "To this day, there are numerous traces in popular belief, especially in Germany, of respect for the snake, which seems to be a survival of ancestor worship, such as still exists among the Zulus and other savage tribes." Okay, I will stop there. Now, you may wonder why I found it important to cover the fact that serpent worship was at one time prevalent in Germany. One reason is because I've been told by some of the opposition that there is no evidence that there was ever any serpent worship in Germany. Another is because just by looking at the map I've displayed, which shows that at one time there was no distinction between Germany and Poland, they were both part of the Teutonic territory where serpent worship was common. And please remember, the word pronounced God in Polish means reptile, just like it means reptile in Russian. So, are we supposed to believe that the German word pronounced Gott is in no way connected to the Polish word pronounced God? Are you sure about that? Okay, I'm going back to the Encyclopedia Britannica article on the Teutonic peoples. As we know, the Teutonic people were eventually converted to Christianity. This article confirms some information we should already know, such as the fact that the Teutons were not converted overnight. It took a very long time, and please don't think they weren't allowed to bring along some of their traditions when they were converted. Also, please remember that one of the deities the Teutons worshipped was Odin, who was also known as Woden. I covered this fact extensively in part 2 of my presentation. In fact, as we're about to learn, Odin was their chief deity. So let's read what this encyclopedia has to say about the religious practices of the pagan Teutons before they were converted to Christianity. It says the conversion of the Teutonic peoples to Christianity was a gradual process covering some 7 centuries. The first to accept the new religion seem to have been the Goths, beginning about the middle of the 4th century, and the Vandals must have followed their example very quickly. A number of gods were certainly known both in England and among many, if not all, the Teutonic peoples of the continent, as well as in the north. Among these were Odin or Woden, Thor, Thunor, and Tyr, also known as Ti, and also Frigg, the wife of Odin. Okay, so we see that the Teutonic peoples worshipped Odin, who was also known as Woden. But if you remember what I covered in part 2, this deity's name was also pronounced Godon. And here's a refresher slide. Here's that quote from Daniel Fenning's book, A New System of Geography, Volume 2. In his narrative covering ancient German or Germanic worship customs, he wrote the following. They also worshipped Woden or Godon, after whom the 4th day of the week was called Wednesday. It is said that this word Godon, becoming afterwards contracted into God, the Germans and English gave that name to the deity. So this was the understanding that Daniel Fenning had when he published his book back in 1765, over 250 years ago. And for those who think Daniel Fenning didn't know what he was talking or writing about, I covered his extensive credentials in part 2. So if you lived in one part of the world belonging to the Teutonic peoples, you might call the chief deity's name Odin. If you lived somewhere else, you might call him Woden. And if you lived somewhere else, you might call him Godon. It's all about dialect, but it's pretty clear he was the chief deity because he's the one they primarily sacrificed to. Here's what we read in this same Encyclopedia Britannica article. Of religious ceremonies, the most important was sacrifice. The victims were of various kinds. Those offered to Odin, Woden, were generally, if not always, men from the time of Tacitus onwards. Human sacrifices to Thor and other gods are not often mentioned. Okay, I'm going to skip down to the underlined sentence. It says, one barbarous custom, which was regarded as a sacrifice, was the dedication of an enemy's army to the gods, especially Odin. And just to reinforce the fact that Odin was the chief deity and the one to whom sacrifices were offered, here's a quote from the book Teutonic Mythology by Jacob Grimm. He authored his book in 1882, and it's in the public domain for anyone interested in doing further research. So here's what Jacob Grimm wrote about Odin. Quote, King Owen the Old sacrificed 9 sons, one after the other, to Odin for his long life. So let's quickly summarize. Odin was the chief deity worshipped by the Teutonic peoples, and another name for Odin was Godon. And according to Daniel Fenning, that name was shortened to God in German and English, and that's the God we see in our English Bibles today. This is the same God whose worship Yahweh condemns, but mankind has collectively snubbed Yahweh in favor of the name that Yahweh detests. But there is more evidence that the chief deity worshipped in ancient Germany was none other than Godon, whose name was shortened to God. This evidence comes from an 8th century author by the name of Paul the Deacon, or as he was known in his native language, Paulus Diaconus. Paul the Deacon is known as the historian of the Lombards, and he was a friend of Charlemagne, otherwise known as Charles the Great. Paul the Deacon was born around the year 720 CE and died around the year 799 CE. His history of the Lombardic people is considered especially valuable for its depictions of the relations between the Lombards and another group of people known as the Franks. But who were the Lombards? Well, according to Paul the Deacon in Book 1, they were originally from Scandinavia, which is located way up in Northern Europe, and they are descended from a small tribe known as the Winili. Eventually, the Winili migrated in search of other lands, and yes, they eventually came to Germany as well as Austria. So, with this introduction to the Winili, let's read how Paul the Deacon says they eventually came to be known as Lombards. The account we're about to read involves a mother named Gambara and her two sons, Ebor and Io, as well as the other people in their clan that was known as the Winili. In chapter 7, it says, the Winili then, having departed from Scandinavia with their leaders Ebor and Io, and coming into the region which is called Skoringa, settled there for some years. And by the way, scholars place ancient Skoringa in Germany, some 25 miles southeast of Hamburg, Germany, on the banks of the Elbe River. It continues, at that time, Ambri and Assi, leaders of the Vandals, were coercing all the neighboring by war. Already elated by many victories, they sent messengers to the Winili to tell them that they should either pay tribute to the Vandals or make ready for the struggles of war. Then Ebor and Io, with the approval of their mother Gambara, determined that it is better to maintain liberty by arms than to stain it by the payment of tribute. They send word to the Vandals by messengers that they will rather fight than be slaves. The Winili were then all in the flower of their youth, but were very few in number, since they had been only the third part of one island of no great size. At this point, the men of old tell a silly story that the Vandals, coming to Godon, or Wotan, besought him for victory over the Winili, and that he answered that he would give victory to those whom he first saw at sunrise. That then Gambara went to Freya, the wife of Godon, and asked for victory for the Winili, and that Freya gave her counsel that the women of the Winili should take down their hair and arrange it upon the face like a beard, and that in the early morning they should present with their husbands, and in like manner station themselves to be seen by Godon from the quarter in which he had been wont to look through his window toward the east. And so it was done. And when Godon saw them at sunrise, he said, "Who are these long beards?" And then Freya induced him to give the victory to those to whom he had given the name. And thus Godon gave the victory to the Winili. These things are worthy of laughter and are to be held of no account, for victory is due not to the power of men, but it is rather furnished from heaven. It is certain, however, that the Langobards were afterwards so called on account of the length of their beards, untouched by the knife, whereas at first they had been called Winili. For according to their language, lang means long and bart means beard. Wotan, indeed, whom by adding a letter they called Godon, is he who among the Romans is called Mercury, and he is worshipped by all the peoples of Germany as a god, though he is deemed to have existed not about these times, but long before, and not in Germany, but in Greece. And that's where I stopped the reading. So according to the legend, as recounted by Paul the Deacon, the Lombards got their name from the deity they worshipped while they were then known as the Winili, and the deity they worshipped was Godon. On top of all this, Paul the Deacon underscores the fact that Godon was worshipped by all the peoples of Germany. If this is true, which it apparently is, then it shouldn't take much deduction to reason that just as claimed by 18th century author Daniel Fenning, Godon was later shortened to God, and presto changeo, the name God is what is found in most every English Bible you can get your hands on. Okay, one of the big arguments presented by those who uphold referring to Yahweh as God is that the word God, found in our English Bibles and used in reference to Yahweh, is not a name and was never a name. It's simply a generic title that the Teutonic peoples used for deity, and that's what the translators chose to use as a translation for the Hebrew Elohim and the Greek title Theos. Now, hopefully by now we can all agree that this argument has been shot down. It's just another deception that most people have fallen for. But just in case you're one of those who's still on the fence about God, and maybe you think this word as handed down to us by the Teutonic peoples really is just a generic title, then maybe this information from Jacob Grimm's book titled Teutonic Mythology will put you on the right side of the fence. And by the way, if you look up Jacob Grimm's credentials, they are top notch. He was a noted linguist and philologist. A philologist is a scholar who researches the history of languages, and indeed, Jacob Grimm authored a book on the history of the German language. When it came to the history of the German word God, Jacob Grimm didn't mince any words. It's more than a word, it's a name. And it's the name of a deity that was and is worshipped in Germany. Here's what he wrote, quote, "In all Teutonic tongues, the Supreme Being has always with one consent been called by the general name God." The remainder of this page is spent addressing different dialects and different forms of God, such as Gud and Khotan. But towards the bottom of the page, he reinforces the fact that God is a proper noun, which means that it's a name. Here's what he writes. Moreover, God and other names of divine beings reject every article. They are too firmly established as proper nouns to need any such distinction. So let me be clear. No matter how you slice it, God is a name and was a name reserved for heathen idols, until the Teutonic peoples were converted to Christianity and allowed to apply that name as a title for Yahweh. But it's more than a title. The majority of English speakers think it is the Creator's true name. And I admit I was among them. I grew up believing that the Creator's name is God. I thought I would throw in this little tidbit from page 14 of Jacob Grimm's book because it is significant that he agrees God was originally part of a compound word. In addressing the word God, he writes, quote, "Our Teutonic word must have been originally a compound," unquote. It's no coincidence that the Gothic or the word Gothic or Goth is very similar to the word God. They're both the same. It's just a linguistic practice of changing the TH to a D before a vowel in inflection, as it says here. So you might think, well, the word God is not followed by a vowel. Maybe not in its shortened form, but what if Godon is the original form? According to this rule, as stated by Jacob Grimm on page 14 of his book, they would not have said Gothon, they would have said Godon. Take off the AN ending at the end there, and you've got God. This is just a quick slide to show you more documentation that serpent worship was at one time common in Prussia. Prussia covered an immense amount of land, including what is now known as Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, and even parts of France and Belgium. That covers a lot of ground. Again, I will skip reading this page for the sake of time. And here's a map, a general map of Prussia. It stretched all the way from Russia to the Netherlands and Belgium. Now that's getting awfully close to England. And with that, let's take a look at how serpent worship did not stop with Prussia. It kept going and going and going. This brings us to Ireland. Ireland is currently known as one of the Celtics' main stomping grounds, the main base for the remnants of the Celtic people. You may recall that at one time, Northern Europe was essentially divided between the Teutonic peoples and the Celtic peoples. Our focus has been on the Teutonic peoples because that's where etymologists claim the word God is traced. But what about the Celtics? You may recall that the Celtic tribes predate the Teutonic tribes, and it is clear that at one time the two groups were one, which in turn suggests their worship practices were quite similar. And here's the map I displayed earlier. As you may recall, this map essentially displays Teutonic and Celtic territories as they were around the year 52 BCE. And remember, both territories included parts of Poland and even Russia. We know what the word God means when spoken in either Russia or Poland. We know serpent worship was common in Prussia, which includes both Poland and Germany. But did serpent worship end there? Or did it expand westward? Westward to Ireland? So that's the question. Did serpent worship spread to Ireland? The answer is a definitive yes. Now, the fact is, there are no snakes in Ireland, or so I've been told. And that's what makes serpent worship in Ireland all the more incredible. Many of us have heard the story or legend of how St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland. This comic presents a play on words involving the word drive. Back on the farm, we actually had cattle drives where we would drive the cattle from one pasture to another. Sometimes we had to drive them down a road to get to the other pasture. That was always an adventure, and suffice it to say, I never look forward to our cattle drives. But everyone familiar with a cattle drive knows that driving cattle down a road doesn't necessarily mean loading them into a truck and driving them somewhere. It can also be used to mean conducting them and sometimes even chasing them. One group would get behind the cattle, another group would be on one side, another group on another side, and then someone would make certain the cows went through the gate leading to the desired pasture. In the same way, the story goes that St. Patrick drove or conducted the snakes out of Ireland. But of course, even if that's what happened, which it most likely didn't, he didn't load them into a car and take off down the road heading out of Ireland, especially since Ireland is an island. Anyway, this is merely light-hearted sidebar into the more sobering fact that although there are no serpents in Ireland, there was indeed serpent worship in Ireland. This is a fact that more than one author has pointed out about Ireland. Here's what 19th century author Marcus Keene wrote in his book, The Towers and Temples in Ancient Ireland. Quote, "Is it not a singular coincidence that in Ireland also, where no living serpent exists, such numerous legends of serpents should abound, and that figures of serpents should be so profusely used to ornament Irish sculpture?" Marcus Keene's book was published in 1867, so just for the record, the information about serpent worship in Ireland is not some recent innovation. But what's so interesting about serpent worship in Ireland is the name of their chief serpent deity. Notice what Marcus Keene wrote on pages 38 and 39 of his book regarding the chief serpent deity worshipped in ancient Ireland. He wrote, "A fourth account of the Laic Fayal, or Stone of Destiny, invented after the introduction of Christianity, is that it was the stone Jacob used for his pillow at Bethel, that God El-Glas, the ancestor of the Celts, received it from Moses when in the wilderness, and that he, God El-Glas, having been bitten by a fiery serpent, was cured by looking at the serpent of brass, for which reason his descendants used the snake entwined on a pole for centuries as their national standard." He goes on to write, "The true solution of these contradictions I believe to be that God El-Glas was not the name of a man, much less of an ancestor of the Celts, but the name of the serpent, which was worshipped by the Kuthites. Mr. O'Brien interprets the name God El Glas, green god snake. It was, in fact, the serpent of paradise, which through primeval traditions found its way into the worship of all the nations of remote antiquity. So, the name of the chief serpent deity in ancient Ireland was God El Glas. The author of this book, who had no axe to grind with his research, mentions the various legends about God El Glas. Some legends maintain that God El Glas was one of the ancient Israelites wandering in the wilderness during those 40 years, but who was bitten by a serpent and then cured by looking upon the brazen serpent. But the author of this book, Marcus Keene, says no, God El Glas was not the name of a man, but rather the name of the serpent who was worshipped by the Kuthites. So who were the Kuthites? If you care to look up who the Kuthites were, they are the Samaritans who were originally from Cutha, but were relocated to Samaria. And where is Cutha? Cutha is in Assyria, 25 miles from the city of Babylon. The first century historian Josephus makes reference to the Kuthites, also known as the Kuthians, as having been transplanted from Cutha to Samaria by the Assyrians, who defeated the northern kingdom of Israel, and they are the same Samaritans who attempted to halt the construction of the temple after the Jews returned to Jerusalem from their captivity in Babylon. And here's a map that shows the ancient Assyrian Empire. And if you look closely at the area I circled to the far right, you can see Babylon and Cutha. According to Josephus, when the Assyrians defeated the northern kingdom of Israel, they transplanted the inhabitants of Cutha to Samaria, and that is why the Samaritans were so despised by Judaism. Not only were they not true Israelites, but they also brought their pagan worshiping ways with them. So here in Marcus Keene's book, he states his professional opinion that God El Glas, the chief serpent deity worshipped in ancient Ireland, is none other than the serpent of paradise, the same serpent who deceived Eve, the same serpent identified in the book of Enoch as God Rael. Notice that both God El Glas and God Rael not only incorporate the name God, but they also incorporate the Hebrew title El. Here's a comparison slide for the two names. Of course, both names incorporate G-A-D, which we should all know by now is pronounced God. So we have God El Glas and God Rael. We have identified God as the idol of fortune whose worship is condemned by Yahweh. We have learned that the short form of Godon is God, a deity worshipped by the Teutonic tribes. We read in the book of Enoch, chapter 68, verse 6, that the name of the angel who deceived Eve is God Rael. If the short form of Godon is God, then the short form of God Rael is God also. Now we come to the word El. Do we need to conduct diligent research to see what the word El means? Surely we all know that El is a short form of the Hebrew title Elohim. Of course, nearly all English Bibles translate El into the English as God. And that's why so many will tell you things like, hey, I'm not saying God is the creator's name, it's a title. So they think as long as we're not trying to push the word God as the creator's name, then it's a perfectly acceptable English title. You may recall the study authored by Dale George and Silvio Soto. In their study, The Truth Regarding Inspired Titles, they wrote, quote, if we truly wish to be honest with the facts, admitting that God and Lord are perfectly acceptable English translations is a linguistic necessity, unquote. This is a quote from page 88 of their revised study that they published in 2001. So God is the commonly accepted English translation of the Hebrew Elohim. And in fact, When translators translate God El Glos, that's exactly how they translate the word El. They translate it as God. And here's a slide showing how translators translate the word El as found in the name God El Glos. The word glos is the ancient Gaelic word for green. So thus far, with the name God El Glos, we have green God, or God green if you prefer in that order, although actually it should be green El or green Elohim. So now then, what does the word God mean? That's right, the word pronounced God in Gaelic means snake. Just like it means reptile in Russian, just like it means reptile in Polish, it means snake in the ancient Celtic language, which is known as Gaelic. And God means snake. It's a serpent, just like Marcus Keene points out in his book. And the serpent's name is God. Just to reinforce the translation offered by Marcus Keene in his book, quote, Mr. O'Brien interprets the name God El Glos, green God snake, unquote. Now be careful with the word God in Mr. O'Brien's rendering. He uses God as the translation of El. A more correct translation would be green Elohim snake. Even more correct would be God the green mighty one. Again, the name of the serpent is God. Its full name, as known to the ancient Celtic people, was God El Glos, and its symbol was a green snake. I wonder if their snake is the same color as the snake who deceived Eve. And do you want to wear green on St. Patrick's Day? And here's a final look at God El Glos. God is his name, and to the ancient Celts, God was the green mighty one, and he was in the form of a serpent, and they worshiped him. And now he's in our Bibles. So now we've come full circle. It all began with Gadrael deceiving Eve. The short form of Gadrael is God. We know God is the short form of the idol named Godon. So why can't God be the short form of Gadrael? It is. That's who God is. God was worshipped in Haran. Leah and Rachel were raised in Haran. Leah and Rachel worshipped idols. Leah named Zilpah's son God. We know Jacob tolerated idol worship, at least until they left Haran. We are commanded to not speak the names of heathen idols. But when believers did mention the names of heathen idols, it was in a disparaging way, intended to show that we should not worship them. We also know that believers who had been named after heathen idols were not expected to change their names. And finally, the worship of God spread all over the globe. We traced it from Haran up through Russia, across the nation of Poland, into Germany, and finally into Ireland. God was simply the name of an idol worshipped all over by those who did not worship Yahweh. But one dot I haven't even mentioned here is the most important of all. Yahweh specifically condemns the worship of God in Isaiah 65, verse 11. If that doesn't make you have second thoughts about whether or not we honor Yahweh by referring to him as God, then I don't really think anything I have to say, even with this lengthy presentation, will persuade you otherwise. This doesn't make me very popular with people, but I'm persuaded that if you truly love Yahweh, you will not want to attribute the name of a heathen idol to him, even as a title. And God is the name of a heathen idol. So here we are today. God has become the universally accepted translation of the Hebrew title Elohim. Go ahead, share this information with your pastor, and see how receptive he will be to discontinuing calling our Heavenly Father God. I know, I've tried it. They will most likely defend the honor of God to the very end, and they will only smile at all the points I've made here in this presentation, all of which are valid points, all of which are grounded in truth. God will most likely continue to be the accepted translation of Elohim until the Messiah's return. The logistics of whether or not we honor Yahweh by referring to him as God bring to mind a TV commercial that aired in 2022 for a truck known as the 2022 GMC Sierra Heavy Duty Premium. The commercial begins innocently enough, showing this beast of a truck effortlessly towing a large trailer through mountainous terrain. Then some of its wonderful features begin displaying on the TV screen. The first one is the Allison 10-speed transmission. Certainly a 10-speed transmission is an attention grabber. But then after 2 seconds, another feature pops up. The next feature says 6.6-liter Duramax turbo diesel. That sounds pretty powerful. But 2 seconds later, another feature appears, and it says up to 36,000 pounds of max towing. Wow, that's definitely a tough truck. But no sooner has your brain registered that particular feature than yet another feature is displayed. At this point, the features begin popping up rapid fire. At the 10-second mark, 4 features flash across the screen. That's right, 4 amazing features in 1 second. I know because I had to play back the video in slow motion just to see them. But that's only the beginning. At the 11-second mark of the commercial, 7 features display in rapid fire intervals. At the 12-second mark, 18 features display in 18 separate flashing frames. That's incredibly fast. That's faster than a human brain can possibly process. Or at least it's way faster than mine can absorb. But the point is well taken. Their point is, this truck is loaded with features. The truck continues to smoothly climb the mountain. Then a guy breaks in and says, "You had me with the Allison 10-speed transmission." That was the very first feature that popped up on the screen. In other words, the announcer is saying, you could have stopped the commercial at the 2-second mark because you sold me on the Allison 10-speed transmission. So, in this presentation, I've made point after point after point, and I'm persuaded that each one in and of itself, each one affirms that we do not honor Yahweh by referring to him as God. I am as loaded with reasons as that 2022 GMC commercial is loaded with features. I could display them all in rapid fire succession, and my presentation would be like a 30-second commercial, chock full of excellent reasons to not refer to Yahweh as God. But like that commercial, no one would be able to retain any of those reasons because they're coming at you rapid fire, way faster than the human brain can absorb. So that's why this presentation isn't as quick and condensed as many would want. And that's also why I've repeated nearly all of my points several times. It's to help you retain it all. However, after all my points are presented, I think we should all be able to break in just like the guy in the commercial and say, "You had me at Isaiah 65:11. I mean, if Yahweh outright condemns the worship of a deity named God, why would we want to call him God? Isn't that an insult to Yahweh? And shouldn't this be about what God means to him instead of what it means to me? Or do you want to be part of the "it's all about me" generation? It's not about me. It's all about Yahweh and what honors him. If I were to say, I condemn the heinous acts perpetrated by Adolf Hitler on innocent men, women, and children, would you then want to honor me by calling me Adolf Hitler? It seems preposterous to even think of doing such a thing. Yet, that is exactly how our world and our culture treats Yahweh. So again, I say, you had me at Isaiah 65, verse 11. If Yahweh condemns the worship of a being whose name is God, the last thing I want to call Yahweh is God, or even say, Yahweh is my God. Okay, when I introduced part 5, I mentioned that when I was finished, I would display a comparison of the connections I have found versus the connections supplied by the world's leading etymologists. I'm borrowing the etymology as listed in the Catholic Encyclopedia, not only because it has one of the longer listings I've found, but also it tends to agree with the other listings I've found in other various references. And here is the basic etymology offered by the Catholic Encyclopedia. It says the root meaning of the name from Gothic root gu, Sanskrit hu or hu, to invoke or sacrifice to, is either the one invoked or the one sacrificed to. Now I'm going to pause here for just a moment and to comment on this Sanskrit word hu that you see here. I need to remind you of one of the earlier slides in this presentation. So just like I said, I need to remind you of one of the earlier slides in this presentation. It's this slide showing a page from the book Irish Druids and Old Irish Religions by James Boswick. On page 183 of his book, he lists a Celtic deity named Hu. And yes, one of the symbols of the deity named Hu was a serpent. So already we have a problem, even with how the modern etymologists trace the origin of the word God. They say it's somehow connected to Hu. And guess what? Hu is the name of a serpent deity. But let's continue with their analysis, or whatever you want to call it. We just read that they trace it to the Gothic word gu and the Sanskrit hu, but they continue their crash course by stating that it comes from different Indo-Germanic roots: div to shine, give light, thes in thesastai to implore, comes from Indo-Iranian diva, Sanskrit deus, Latin deus, Greek theos, Irish and Gaelic dia, all of which are generic names. Also Greek Zeus, the genitive Dios, Latin Jupiter, Old Teutonic tu or tu, surviving in Tuesday, Latin Janus, Diana, and other proper names of pagan deities. The common name most widely used in Semitic occurs as El in Hebrew, Elu in Babylonian, Elah in Arabic, etc. And those scholars are not agreed on the point the root meaning most probably is the strong or mighty one. Okay, so the etymologists generally agree that the word God is ultimately traced to the Gothic word gu, which doesn't really sound like God at all, except for the g sound. And here, just to confirm that most scholars agree with the Catholic Encyclopedia's tracing of the origin of the word God, here's what we find in the 1901 edition of a New English Dictionary on Historical Principles. This dictionary is now known as the Oxford English Dictionary. Both references agree that the word God is most likely traced to the word gu, spelled G-H-E-U, and apparently pronounced either geu or gu. I remember years ago, I discussed this very topic with one of my coworkers. I shared the etymologist's conclusion about the origin of the word God being traced to gu. My coworker laughed and he said, "That sounds like a gooey mess." I think his summary adequately describes the etymologist's best attempts at trying to trace the origin of the word God. It's a gooey mess, but it satisfies the curiosity of many believers. It does not satisfy my curiosity, and that's why I maintain that my findings make more sense. I do not trace God to gu. I trace God to a false idol named God. It's too simple for the etymologists with PhDs to see and too inconvenient for those who've already made up their minds to believe. So let's do a quick comparison of my connections against the connections of the leading etymologists. Here's where the classic etymologists say the English word God comes from. It starts with the Gothic root gu, but they also include the Sanskrit hu. Then they go to the Indo-Germanic roots div and thes. These Indo-Germanic roots do nothing but add to the confusion because they sound nothing like God. You might ask how one word can be derived from another word that doesn't even remotely sound the same. And that would be an excellent question because it makes absolutely no sense. But that's only the beginning of their maze of confusion. Then they take us to the Sanskrit words deos and divas. Then they go to the Latin Deus, which again sounds nothing like God. Then they take you to Zeus. Now, how does that make you feel, knowing that the so-called expert etymologists tell you that God is traced to Zeus? They then take you to the Greek word theos, which can be shown as being the generic Greek word for deity. I know people have tried to make out like theos is the theos can be traced to the name of a pagan deity, but in the end, I found their research to be flawed. There's a widely circulated book out there by the name of Come Out of Her, My People by C.J. Coster, in which the author made the claim that there were two deities named Theos and Theia. But when I checked out his reference, it turned out Theos and Theia were merely the titles for two deities named Pluto and Persephone. If you look at the next word on the Catholic Encyclopedia's list, it's Dia, which sounds nothing like God, but then they take you to the name Tu, which also sounds nothing like God. And then to top it all off, they take you to the Latin Janus and Diana and other proper names of pagan deities. That's the key words there, proper names of pagan deities. Do you get what they're saying? Do you get what they're admitting? They're admitting that God is traced to the proper names of pagan deities. And we're supposed to think it's okay to refer to our most high, holy creator with a title that's traced to the names of pagan deities. If you think it's a-okay to do that, then let's just say that we are not wired the same. On the other side of this slide is what I come up with when I try my hand at tracing the origin of the word God. I find from an ancient writing known as the Book of Enoch that the name of the serpent who deceived Eve is Gadrael. The short form of Gadrael is God. Next, I find an idol whose worship Yahweh himself condemns in Isaiah 65:11. That name is God. I then find where Leah, who was raised in the city of Haran by an idol-worshiping father named Jacob's seventh son, God. And yes, that name in Hebrew is pronounced God. It is also a known fact that an idol named God was worshipped in Leah's hometown of Haran. It's also a fact that God was worshipped in other places, such as Dura Europos and Palmyra. If you travel north to Russia, you can find that the Russian word for reptile is God. If you can remember that God is a deity of fortune, then it should come as no surprise that the Russian word for fortune teller is Godalka. As you travel westward through Russia, you eventually come to Poland, and the Polish word for reptile is God. I have shown that in ancient times and even in fairly modern times, serpent worship was practiced in both Russia and Poland. If you keep going west, you come to Ireland, where the ancient Celtic peoples worshipped an idol named God El Glas, who was a green snake deity. We know the Gaelic word glas means green. We know El is a form of the Hebrew word Elohim. So which portion of God El Glas means snake? That's right, it's God. And if the 18th century scholar Daniel Fenning was correct in his research, God is the contraction of Godon, a Lombardic deity, also known as Woden or Odin. And the contracted word God is what made its way into our English Bibles. So, are Godon and God El Glas the same? I maintain that yes, they are. As the 10 tribes of Israel scattered across different regions of the globe, they carried the remnants of the ancient God worship with them. If God is traced to the name of the serpent who deceived Eve, I rather imagine he doesn't mind all the variations which contain the short form pronounced God. Is it just a coincidence that we find separate deities emerging from separate areas of Europe whose contracted forms are both pronounced God? I'm not a mathematician, but I can imagine that the odds of separate deities emerging and converging, both with names that are contracted to God, those are rather astronomical odds. We know the adversary is very cunning. Is he capable of orchestrating a clever maneuver that resulted in his actual name being mistaken as the Creator's name. Yes, of course he's capable. How else could he possibly fulfill the prophecy found in Revelation 12 and verse 9? Let's read the prophecy of Revelation 12, 9 through 10. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our sovereign, and the power of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our sovereign day and night. Once the adversary, and that's what Satan means, is adversary, once he is cast out, his deceptive scheming will be over, and that is when salvation comes. That is when strength comes. That's when the kingdom of our sovereign Messiah, Yahweh and his Messiah, that's when Yeshua will emerge in all his glory. But until that time, just think of all the ways we've been deceived. It boggles my mind to think of all the things I've been deceived into believing. And I do not claim to have uncovered all the deceptions yet, but I'm trying. And one by one, those who study are able to sort out truth from deception. Is what I presented here one of the many deceptions? Has the adversary duped the world into believing that his name is the name of the true Creator? If God is the name of the devil, do we honor Yahweh by referring to him as God? And I want to thank you for your great patience in allowing me to present my findings from A to Z. I am a truth seeker. You may not agree with my findings, but for those who have questioned my sanity for believing as I do, I appreciate you allowing me to at least share why I believe the way I do. For those who disagree, or even if you think I omitted some important items that should have been covered, I welcome constructive criticism given in the spirit of love. Thanks again, and may Yahweh bless you as you study his word.